In the 1920s, every diabetic patient was told the same thing: cut the carbs or die. Then insulin arrived, and suddenly that life-saving advice became heresy. But here's the shocking truth. The science behind carb restriction never changed. The only thing that did was who stood to profit. So we're going to talk about when standard medical practice became heresy. In the 1920s, if you had diabetes, your doctor restricted your carbohydrates. This was standard medical practice. Textbooks recommended it, hospitals implemented it, patients survived on it. Then insulin arrived in 1921 and everything changed. Not because the dietary approach stopped working. It never stopped working. The biochemistry didn't change. Human metabolism didn't evolve. What changed was institutional incentive, i.e., follow the money. Insulin offered something dietary restriction couldn't: a pharmaceutical solution that was easier to prescribe, simpler to dose, and far more profitable to manufacture. Patients could eat higher amounts of carbohydrates as long as insulin managed their blood sugar levels. The medical establishment embraced this shift enthusiastically. Teaching strict dietary adherence was difficult. Monitoring patient compliance was challenging, but writing prescriptions? Oh, that scaled beautifully. Within years, carbohydrate restriction transformed from standard practice to an outdated relic. The ketogenic diet, initially used successfully for diabetes management, lost favor as insulin therapy became dominant. Nobody rigorously tested whether this new high-carb, insulin-managed approach produced better long-term outcomes than the dietary method it replaced. They just assumed it did. So there's a whole bunch of evidence that nobody ever wanted. A century later, right, the data tells a different story. A January 2025 meta-analysis found that low-carbohydrate diets improved HbA1c by 0.29% in type 2 diabetes patients at 3 months. Multiple randomized controlled trials, right, demonstrate that carbohydrate restriction improves triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, insulin sensitivity, and glycemic control. These improvements occur independently of weight loss. Think about that again. The metabolic benefits appear before patients shed significant pounds. This contradicts the conventional assumption that weight loss itself drives therapeutic outcomes. A 2025 meta-analysis incorporating 41 studies with 3,806 adults concluded that low-carbohydrate interventions benefit metabolic syndrome and its components. 25 of these studies qualified as high-quality research. The mechanism is straightforward. Carbohydrate restriction reduces blood glucose excursions, which lowers insulin secretion from pancreatic beta cells. Lower insulin levels break the cycle of hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. Tissues respond better to insulin within days to weeks. The body shifts from burning glucose to burning stored fat. Inflammation markers drop, mitochondrial function improves. This happens quickly, often before the scale moves. Well, what happens inside? When carbohydrate intake drops, the body adapts rapidly at the cellular level. Serum retinol binding protein 4, an adipokine linked to insulin resistance, decreases significantly. Part of the insulin resistance starts to drop, right? This change correlates tightly with carbohydrate intake rather than weight loss. Lower RPB4 levels improve glucose and lipid metabolism almost immediately. The metabolic shift to fat and ketone utilization enhances metabolic flexibility. Cells regain their ability to efficiently switch between fuel sources, a capacity that insulin resistance impairs. Patients often experience temporary brain fog during the first few weeks as their brains adjust from glucose to ketones as primary fuel. This adaptation period is real but brief, and we always recommend that people take a few weeks to transition from eating a standard high carb diet to a ketogenic carnivore type diet to give your body a time to adjust to it and for your gut microbiome to adjust to it as well. Okay? After full keto adaptation, once again, 2 to 6 weeks, cognitive function typically improves, mental clarity sharpens, focus sustains longer, the brain's energy supply becomes more stable because ketones provide efficient fuel with less oxidative stress than glucose metabolism. It's a better, cleaner fuel. Ketones can supply up to 70 to 95% of the brain's energy needs after adaptation. Gluconeogenesis produces the remaining glucose required for specific brain cells that cannot use ketones. Physical performance, and gluconeogenesis is when your liver produces glucose for those few functions that need it. Okay, your body doesn't need to eat any carbohydrates. Physical performance follows a similar pattern. Athletes may experience temporary decline in high-intensity capacity during the initial 2 to 4 weeks. Then mitochondrial biogenesis upregulates. Monocarboxylate transporters increase. Fat oxidation enzymes multiply. Your body turns into a fat-burning machine. After adaptation, endurance and fat oxidation capacity often match or exceed performance on high carbohydrate diets. They actually tend to exceed, quite honestly. Mitochondrial efficiency increases up to 4-fold in some studies. Central fatigue decreases. Body composition improves. The biochemistry is clear. The clinical outcomes are consistent. The mechanisms are well understood. So why does institutional medicine still resist? Well, there is an organized machinery to the resistance. Medical and nutritional institutions have endorsed high carbohydrate, low-fat dietary paradigms for decades, right? As well as the government, by the way, right? Changing established guidelines requires overcoming bureaucratic and cultural inertia within professional organizations and regulatory bodies. The inertia is not accidental. Pharmaceutical companies benefit financially from ongoing treatment of metabolic diseases with medications rather than dietary interventions. They can't patent and they can't sell you dietary interventions, but they can certainly sell you all different kinds of pharmaceuticals. Food industry players producing high carbohydrate processed foods have vested interests in maintaining carbohydrate-centric guidelines. Because that's where they make their money, right? Industry funding influences research agendas, medical education, and continuing education programs. This creates systematic bias against carbohydrate restriction. Okay? The ideological commitment runs deeper than economics. The low-fat, high-carbohydrate paradigm became the dominant following influential mid-20th century studies. This ideology demonized dietary fat and elevated carbohydrates, shaping decades of research, policy, and public health messaging. But we'll get back to those studies in another video, which were all false, by the way, for the most part. Even as evidence mounts against this paradigm, institutions remain committed due to cultural, academic, and political reasons. Follow the money again. Cognitive dissonance makes it difficult for clinicians and researchers to reconcile new evidence with long-held beliefs. Guidelines have become rigid rule books rather than flexible tools. This rigidity prioritizes conformity over individualized patient care and emerging evidence. Healthcare professionals who advocate for low-carbohydrate diets risk professional repercussions, loss of income, damaged reputation, and sometimes loss of license. The price of orthodoxy, right? Dr. Tim Noakes, one of my mentors, faced a professional conduct hearing by the Health Professions Council of South Africa between 2015 and 2018 for promoting low-carbohydrate, high-fat dietary advice. The complaint came from dietitians influenced by professional turf wars and vested interests from food production and pharmaceutical sectors. Despite robust scientific evidence supporting his recommendations, he endured years of intense scrutiny and professional risk. The hearing became known as the Nutritional Nutrition hearing of the century. He wasn't the only one. Dr. Gary Fettke, an orthopedic surgeon in Australia, was reported multiple times to the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency for publicly discussing benefits of low carbohydrate diets. He faced threats of losing his medical license. Ethics committees blocked his research efforts, with conflicts of interest involving dietitians and industry ties identified. The people who were blocking him had these conflicts of interest identified in their background. These cases are not isolated incidents. They represent a pattern of regulatory bodies functioning as enforcement mechanisms for dietary orthodoxy rather than protectors of patient welfare. The regulatory environment enforces adherence to established guidelines that often exclude or minimize carbohydrate restriction. This creates a chilling effect, discouraging clinicians from adopting evidence-based but non-conforming dietary interventions. Meanwhile, the human cost continues to accumulate. Millions of individuals suffer preventable morbidity and mortality due to delayed adoption of effective dietary interventions. Patients experience prolonged disease progression, increased medication dependence, and higher risk of cardiovascular disease, kidney failure, and other metabolic complications. Every year of delay translates into thousands of preventable cases of diabetes complications, cardiovascular events, and premature deaths. When institutional adherence to outdated paradigms result in harm that could be mitigated by existing evidence-based interventions, it crosses from scientific caution into ethical failure. So, wait a minute. How does knowledge spread then? Right? If institutional resistance persists for another decade, metabolic knowledge will spread through alternative pathways. And that's what we're presenting here, right? Direct-to-consumer education is expanding rapidly. Credible science-based resources online allow patients to learn about carbohydrate restriction independently. Platforms offering educational content, recipe libraries, and success stories demystify ketogenic and low-carb approaches. Continuous glucose monitors, I love CGMs, along with ketone meters and other biofeedback tools, empower individuals to observe in real time metabolic responses. This reinforces behavior change through immediate biological feedback. Okay? Once again, these are great tools. Don't chase the results from the tools. Just use them to show where you're moving towards, but they're great tools to help you see what's really happening in your body. Patient communities and forums provide peer support, motivation, and shared experiences. This fosters grassroots adoption outside traditional medical channels. Organizations like the Society for Metabolic Health Practitioners, which I'm a member of and I have an accreditation from, offer training, consensus guidelines, and research support for clinicians interested in carbohydrate restriction. Peer networks facilitate knowledge, exchange, mentorship, and advocacy within the medical community. Specialized certification programs enhance clinician confidence and credibility in prescribing these therapies without institutional backing. Telemedicine platforms enable continuous remote support, education, and monitoring. Apps integrating dietary tracking, biomarker monitoring, and coaching provide personalized feedback and accountability. Remote care models have demonstrated success in sustaining carbohydrate restriction and metabolic improvements over the years. These technologies reduce barriers related to geography, access, and traditional healthcare constraints. Patient-led advocacy groups and social media campaigns raise awareness and challenge outdated paradigms. Sharing personal health transformations creates social proof and shifts cultural norms around diet and metabolic health. Independent research platforms and open access journals focused on metabolic health provide venues for disseminating research free from traditional gatekeeping. This expands the evidence base and influences practices outside conventional publication channels. These alternative pathways collectively offer a robust ecosystem to bypass traditional barriers. They enable widespread access to effective metabolic therapies outside conventional institutional channels. So what makes this time different? Well, carbohydrate restriction has been dismissed before. What prevents another century of abandonment? The current resurgence differs fundamentally from earlier iterations. The evidence base is vast and converging. Numerous randomized controlled trials and meta-analysis demonstrate superior metabolic outcomes. Mechanistic, biochemical, and physiological understanding of insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome is well established. And that's something very important. If you're listening to other people talk, and I suggest go ahead, get all kinds of opinions on how diet can shape your health. Understand that if they don't have a mechanistic, biochemical, physiological rationale behind what they're trying to tell you to do, then it's just dogma and it's garbage in the most case. Okay? In my opinion. Long-term clinical experience with thousands of patients shows sustained benefits and safety. This convergence from multiple lines of inquiry strengthens the scientific foundation beyond anecdote or isolated studies. Institutional and cultural shifts are occurring gradually. Growing recognition of the limitations and harms of the low-fat, high-carbohydrate paradigm prompts changes in professional guidelines and public health messaging. Okay? Increasing numbers of clinicians are trained and advocate right now for a carbohydrate restriction, supported by professional organizations and specialized networks. Patient demand and empowerment through technology and education create bottom-up pressure for change. These factors create a more resilient and multifaceted movement than previous isolated efforts. Integration with personalized medicine allows tailoring carbohydrate intake to individual metabolic phenotypes. This precision approach aligns with modern medical trends, increasing acceptance and reducing one-size-fits-all criticisms. The tipping point approaches when large-scale, long-term, randomized controlled trials measure hard clinical endpoints, incidence of cardiovascular events, diabetes remission rates, and all-cause mortality. These trials require rigorous dietary adherence, verification, and diverse population. Consistent real-world effectiveness and safety data from large observational studies and registries will demonstrate sustained metabolic health improvements across diverse clinical settings. Integration of patient-reported outcomes and quality-of-life measures strengthens the case. Identification and validation of reliable biomarkers that predict and monitor response to carbohydrate restriction will link clinical outcomes to underlying biology with precision. Formal adoption of carbohydrate restriction protocols in national and international guidelines for diabetes, obesity, and metabolic syndrome management will signal consensus. This facilitates widespread clinical implementation without professional risk. Together, these elements move carbohydrate restriction from contested therapy to accepted standard of care. The metabolic crisis cannot afford another century of institutional delay. The biochemistry remains unchanged since the 1920s. The clinical outcomes remain consistent across decades of research. What has changed is the ecosystem supporting knowledge dissemination outside traditional channels. Alternative pathways now exist that did not exist during previous cycles of suppression. Medical truth is not solely determined by scientific data. It is shaped by social, cultural, and institutional factors. But when evidence accumulates across multiple domains, when alternative dissemination pathways emerge, when patient outcomes speak louder than institutional orthodoxy, paradigm shifts become inevitable. The question is no longer whether carbohydrate restriction will achieve mainstream acceptance. The question is how many more years of preventable suffering will accumulate before institutions acknowledge what clinicians and patients already know. Standard medical practice became heresy in 1921. A century later, heresy is becoming standard practice once again. This time the evidence is too strong, the pathways are too numerous, and the human cost too high for history to repeat itself. Thanks for your attention. If you haven't done so, please leave a comment or a question in the appropriate section. I will answer appropriately all comments and questions, okay? If you haven't, also think about liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing the video with some friends who might need it. It helps the channel a great deal, and I thank you for that. And it helps a bunch of other people because we can keep producing material for you, all right? Also, think about joining my group health coaching platform. The link will be in the description. We have a lot of resources available for you, including all kinds of additional information that provides additional insights into every YouTube video that we're producing from now on. So you'll see that on there. Give it a try. It's only $10 a month. We try to keep the cost as low as possible to invite as many people who can to participate. Okay? So just think about that. And thank you all for your time. Have a great day.